Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to build an expense tracker using React. If you are new to React, this is a perfect project for you. Or if you are not new to React and you wish to solidify your knowledge of the fundamentals of React, this is also a perfect project for you. Why do you really need to build this project? By the end of this video, you will have a good knowledge of JSS. You will understand React props and component communication. You will understand state and controlled input. You will be able to create and delete expense. You will understand the component-based architecture of React. You will understand how to map arrays in React. You will also understand conditional rendering and styling in React. And of course, you will know how to think like a React dev. So I will advise you to relax, pick your popcorn, and let's jump in. In order to build this project, we are going to be making use of Vite. So if you're on Windows, simply open your command prompts. And if you're on Mac, you can simply open your terminal. And the first thing we want to do is to navigate to where we want to create this project folder, okay? And for me, I am going to navigate to my desktop. So you can navigate to your desktop using CD space, then desktop. Hit enter. Great. So next, go to your web browser, and here on your web browser, simply type React Vite, okay? Open this very first option and scroll down. Once you scroll down, for the purpose of this project, I am going to be using PNPM, okay? I am not using NPM, not using Yarn. Let's use this PNPM. Open back your terminal. And here on our terminal, we simply type PNPM, create Vite, hit enter, and now let's specify the project name. So we can simply say React Expense Tracker, hit enter, and now we need to select a framework. We are using React. For now, let's not use TypeScript. So in the future project, we'll be using TypeScript, but for now, let's stick to JavaScript. And now you see, so fast, we have created our React project. So now we have to navigate to this directory by simply typing cd React Expense Tracker. Hit enter. The next thing I'm going to do is to open this particular project folder in a code editor. I am going to be using VS Code. Feel free to use any code editor of your choice, okay? So now let's open this folder in a code editor. Right from the terminal, I can simply type code, then dots, and hit enter. Great. And here is our project directory, okay? Now let's actually run this application and see the initial thing we have, okay? So you can open the built-in terminal in your code editor. Either you come to this place, up here you see terminal, click on terminal and click on this new terminal. Or on Mac, you can simply press Command J or Control J on Windows. So on Mac, I will use Command J. So in order to run this project, the first thing we need to do is to install all our dependencies. Okay, so if you open your package.json, you see the list of all the dependencies we need. We have React and React DOM. And for the dev dependencies, we have all this. In order to install this, we simply use pnpm install. Okay, so simply type pnpm install and hit enter. This is going to install all our dependencies. Okay, great. Now we have installed all our dependencies. The next thing we want to do is to actually run this project. And to do that, simply open your package.json and look for scripts. Okay, so here we have these scripts. You see the option to run this project in development mode. Okay, so simply open back your terminal. First, let's clear this terminal. Just type clear, then type pnpm run dev, because here we have dev. Hit enter. Great. Now we have our project running on localhost port 5174. Okay, for your case, this should be 5173. This here is our web page. Okay, so let's shift this tab to the first place. Okay, and for now we can actually toggle this terminal using Command J. You can toggle the terminal. Okay, so the first thing we are going to do is to remove whatsoever we don't need. The first one we are going to delete is this index.css file. Okay, let's delete this. We don't need it. And once you delete that, you go to main.js and remove the imports here. Okay, because in main.js, the index.css is imported. And now you see that style is actually gone. Next, let's clear all the style in this app.css. We also don't need it. And finally, let's remove everything here so that we build up our project from scratch. Okay, great. Yes, now it is time to build this application step by step, understanding how React works. The first thing we need to do, let's actually add back the app components. And you know, component in React is simply a function. Okay, a function that returns JSS. Remember we said a function, so we simply say function app. Okay, so you see this is basically a function. This function needs to return what we call JSS, JavaScript SML. And this JSS simply allows us to write HTML in React. Okay, it makes it easier to write and add HTML in React. It's like having HTML inside your JavaScript file. So we can simply say that JSS is like a syntax extension for JavaScript that lets us write HTML-like markup inside a JavaScript file. Okay, so for now, let's simply return h1. And here we simply say React expense tracker. Okay, and finally we export this component. So export default app, and let's save this. Great. And here we have that h1. Okay, before we continue, let's go back to the application we want to build. Okay, so in this particular application, we want to understand the different components we are going to be having. React applications are basically made out of components. Okay, so the first thing you need to do when you see a UI is actually look for a way to break that complex UI into smaller units. And these units, in this case, we are going to call that a component. So visually on this particular page, we can clearly divide this component into three places. Okay, into three components. The first component is going to be the app component, which is going to be the main component hosting everything. Okay, then next we are going to have a component that will hold this form, and we are going to call that our expense form. Then we'll have a component that will hold this list. Okay, remember we can break this down into more components because this item is a component on its own. But for now, let's go with the app component, the form component, and the list component. Okay, so we have two more components, and in order to follow best practices, we need to create a new folder inside our SRC, and let's call these components. Okay, so the first one we need to add here is the expense form component. So right here in this component, let's create a file and let's call this expense form.jss. Okay, hit enter, and here let's simply build this component. So function expense form, and for now let's simply return a paragraph that says form. Okay, please correct this should be returned. Okay, let's save this, and finally here we export default expense form. Next, let's add the second component, which is going to be the expense list. So here we say expense list.jss function expense list, and let's simply return a paragraph. Here let's just say list, and of course we need to export this function because we need to use it in another file. So we say export default expense lists. and save this. Okay, so now we have these two components, the list component and the form component. The next thing we need to do, remember we said the app component is the parent component. It is the main component. And as you see, the app component basically owed everything we have on this page. So we have to go back to the app and tell the app that, hey, app, you now have two children, okay? Now you have a form and you also have the list. So what we need to do here is to bring in those two things. So in order to do that, let's put a bracket here and let's move this and put it inside this bracket. Okay. Now, after this H1, you can bring this down this way. After the H1, we now want to bring in these two components. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to import those components into this particular file. And we do that by simply saying import. So here we have expense form. Okay, so you can select this first one. You simply import expense form from .components/expense form, because here we have a folder which is on the same level with our app.js, and that is why here we use these dots. Okay, so /component/expense form. We do the same thing for the expense list. We simply import expense list from components/expense list. Great. Let's put a space here so that we make our code very neat. Great. So let's bring back our brackets here. I have a formatter. I think Prettier is doing something here. In order to bring in this component here, you simply write something that looks like your normal HTML tag. So you use the less than, then the name of this component. The first one is the expense form, and you write something like a save closing tag. Okay, let's save this. And now we have a problem. There is an error. And here we see this error because in React, we cannot return our markup like this. We can only return one main. Okay, so one thing we can do is to simply wrap this inside the div. For now, let's wrap everything here inside the div. And now we are returning one main thing, which is this div. So inside this div, we cannot add many things here. Okay, so either we use this div or we can simply use these fragments. Okay, if you do this, this works. But for now, let's simply use div. We'll understand fragments later. So now we have our expense form. Let's add our expense list. Okay, so for now, we bring this in like a self-closing tag. We'll also see that we can also do this. Okay, we can also write this like this. It works normal. If you go back to our page, now you see this form and you see this list. So either you put it like this or the other way around. For now, we are going to stick to this. Later, we will see a good use case for the other one that looks like an opening and a closing HTML tag. Okay, so now we imported our expense form and our expense list inside our app. Great. So the next thing we are going to do is to build the form components. Okay, so let's go back to the form components and let's actually build this up. So for that, we are going to be using the HTML form, and inside this form, let's add an input field. The first one is going to be of type text. And for the placeholder, we simply say expense title. Okay, let's put another input for the amount. And the type here is going to be number. Let's set the minimum to 0. Okay, so if you set the minimum to 0, that means here we cannot have -1. Okay, so if you remove this and save your file, go back here, you'll be able to add negative value. But for our amount, we really don't want a negative value. So we simply set the minimum to 0. So we simply set the minimum to 0 and save this. Okay, so now we have just 0. Great. And for the placeholder, let's simply say amount. And we need another input field, and this here is for the date. Okay, so the type is simply going to be date. Now we have this tree. Great. And finally, we need to add a button. Okay, so here we simply say button. Okay, and here we simply say add expense. Good. So now we have this. Before we move on, let's actually style this form a little bit. So here, let's give this form a class name of expense form. Okay, let's go back to our app.js. And for this div, let's give this div a class name of tracker. Okay, now let's go to the CSS file, app.css. Let's select the body. Okay, and if you are wondering where this body is coming from, remember, for your web page, HTML actually remains the fundamental. It remains the skeleton. If you go to this index.html file, okay, we have our body. And everything we do is actually in here in this div, which we access in our main.js. Okay, so this here, we get element by ID root. So the body is right from the index.html file. Okay, so let's tie that body. Let's first set the margin to 0. Let's set the padding to 0. Let's change the font family. For the purpose of this project, let's simply use sans serif. And let's change the background color to F0, F4, F8. Okay, and when you save this file, you see that these styles are actually not being applied. Let me show you that. If we change this color to red and save this, the page is not red. And this is because these particular styles here are not being applied. In order to make sure that the styles we have in this app.css is going to be applied on this particular page, we need to import the app.css in the right place. So here, let's simply import app.css. Okay, so here we say import./app.css and save this. Immediately you save this, you now see that the page is red. Okay, so let's go back here and change this style back to what we have. Good. Next, let's select the tracker. Okay, and for that, let's set the max width to, let's say, 50%. Let's set the margin. Let's set a margin of 40 pixels, then auto left and right. Let's set padding to 30 pixels. That's up, bottom, left and right. The background to white. Let's add some border radius of 0 of 12 pixels and box shadow of 0 for the horizontal offsets, 5 pixels vertical, 20 pixels, then RGBA. Let's use 0, 0, 0, then 0.08. Okay, so now we have this. Let's tie the H1. And for the H1, let's test align to the center. Let's change the color to, let's simply use 333. And let's set margin bottom to 30 pixels. Let's change this color. Here, let's say 2B, 6C, B0. Okay, let's use this color. Perfect. Let's tie the expense form. And for that, let's display flex. Okay, and you know, by default, for flexbox, the direction is row. So let's change the flex direction. And let's set this to colon. Let's add gap of 12 pixels. And let's add some margin bottom of 20 pixels. Okay, so now we have this. Let's tie the input. So here we say .expense form, the input field. So we are selecting the input element itself. And here we want to increase the padding. So we want to add some breathing space here. Let's use 10 pixels. Okay, I think that is okay. Let's change the border. Okay, for this, let's say 1 pixel solid. And for the color, let's use DDD. That looks better. Let's change the border radius. Okay, let's change this. The border radius. Let's set that to 8 pixels. Let's increase the font size. Let's set the font size to 16 pixels. Okay, and let's change the color. Here, let's use 333. Perfect. And this is actually better. The next thing we need to do here is to simply style this button. Okay, and let's select the button inside the expense form. First, let's increase the padding to 10 pixels. Let's change the background color to, let's use 2B CC B0. Okay, the same color with the H1. Let's set the text color to white. Okay, so we simply use FFF. Okay, so we have this, but this black stuff, let's remove the border because that looks so bad. So border, we set that to none. Good. And that removes that ugly border. Okay, let's change the border radius. Let's use 8 pixels for uniformity. Good. Let's also set the font size to 16 pixels. Let's change the cursor to pointer. And let's add some transition on the background color. Here, let's use 0.3 second delay. Okay, so let's select this and put that here. When we hover on this, using the over pseudo class, we want to change the background color to, here, let's use 2C 5282. Okay, so when we hover on that, we have this. And this looks so nice already. Great. So our goal here is, first, we need to be able to create an expense. Okay, we want to type our expense title, enter the amount, the date, and be able to see them here. Okay, so let's actually build up this list. And in order to build up this list, the first thing we need to do is to go back to our app.js. So in our app.js, let's add a simple array. Okay, so here we want to add an array, and this is just a normal JavaScript array. Okay, here let's say const initial expenses is equal to, okay, so this is going to be array of objects. And the first, we need an ID. Here let's simply say 1. Next, let's add title. Here, let's just pass a string and let's say groceries. Then amount. This should be of type number. And let's just say 60. And finally, we have dates. And this should be of type string. Let's say 2025, May 1st. Okay. Now, we can copy this and repeat it 3 times. Let's change this to house rent. Here, let's say 600, and let's change this to 2. Let's change this to 02. Let's change this to 01. Let this be 25. Let's change this to April. For this, let's say internet bills. Let's change this to, let's say 50. Great. Now we have an initial array. We want to display these arrays in this particular list. Now, in order for React to be able to keep track of what happens to this particular array, for instance, if there is any change, if we change any item in this array or add an item to the array, we want React to be able to keep track of that. And for React to keep track of that, we need to use what we call the React memory. And the React memory is simply what we call states, okay? So we have to use a React hook, and this hook is called state. Okay, so that means here inside our app, we need to add a state in order to manage this data for us. So here, let's simply say const. Here we call these expenses, and the next one, let's call this set expenses. And I'm going to explain what this is in a moment. Here, let's simply say use state. Okay, and in React, when you see this use state, use effect, use memo, these are all hooks. Okay, so here we need to actually call this just like this. Now, this here is going to represent our expenses. Okay, this can be anything. It can be an array. Okay, so in this case, this is going to be an array. It can be an object. It can be a string. It can be Boolean. But in our case, this is going to be an array. Okay, so these expenses here is going to represent our array. And this second item here, this is simply a function. We call this set expenses because it is a function that we are going to be using to manipulate this particular array. And here we can pass our initial data, okay? So we can pass our initial arrays, which is this initial expenses. So here we simply say initial expenses. Now we can save this. Good. Now to confirm this here, remember this here is a JavaScript file, right? So we can simply say console.log expenses and save this file. Now let's go to our browser and check if we can actually see this, and let's see what exactly it is. So here you can open your terminal. On Mac, you can simply do that pressing Command Option J, okay, and that opens your terminal. And I think on Windows that should be Control, okay. And we can also open the terminal by simply right clicking on this page and click on this inspect. When you click on that inspect, you have the developer tools, so you can navigate to the console. And once you navigate to the console, you actually see that list, okay. So this here is coming from our app.js on line 29, okay. So you see here, you see this coming from line 29. Pay attention to how this list is actually displayed twice. Here, let's clear this and actually refresh this page. When you refresh that, you see that you have this list. React shows us this 2 times, and later we are going to see the reason behind this. But now you see that we have access to this particular list. So what we are going to do is to simply pass this list. We are not using it here for now. There is another thing to pay attention to. We need to show these items here in this particular component. But how do we actually let this component have access to this list? We do that using what we call prop, okay. Now remember what I said, that this second one is a function. So let's actually see that. Console.log set expenses and save this file. Let's go back to our console. So and now you see that this is a function, okay. You are going to understand this clearly very soon. Good. Now we can also remove all this because what we did here is actually called destructuring, okay. So one thing we can do is to remove all this, and here we can say expenses. If you save this, let's actually console.log expenses. And now if you console.log expenses, you will have an array, okay. You have an array containing 2 things: this initial expenses and also the function. So let's confirm this. If you go back here, you now have an array of your initial expenses, okay. So you can open up this and you will see that this here is our expenses, and the second item in this array is a function. Do you see that? Then you see this is a function. So what we did initially was to simply destructure, okay. So let's bring that back. We destructured the array and we have access to our expenses and our set expenses. Great. Since we now have access to this list of expenses, how do we actually display that list inside this particular component? Okay, we want to build that list here in our expense list. But the point is, this array lives inside the app component. Okay, so we need a way of telling the app component, hey, pass these particular arrays into your child component. Okay, pass a data from the parent component to the child component. And we can simply do this using what we call prop. Okay, so prop enables us to send information from the parent component to the child component. Okay, so in order to do this, we can simply say expenses is equal to, we use this curly brackets because in React, this curly bracket enable us to write JavaScript inside HTML. And let me show you that. For now, let's remove this. We'll do this very soon. Here in our H1, let's put this curly bracket, and here we can write any JavaScript code. For instance, if you say date.now and save this file, okay, and here you see we have this. So with this curly bracket, we can write JavaScript code, okay? So let's go back to passing this information, the initial expenses, into this particular component using prop. So here we say expenses is equal to, and we use the curly bracket, okay? And here we can now pass these expenses, okay? We pass these expenses, and remember this here is from our state, okay? Good. Now let's go back to our expense list. Remember, in the parent component, in the app component, we are sending this data to this list. So in the list, we need to accept this data. Remember, we called this props, which is just a short form for properties, okay? So here we can simply say props. Okay, good. And the first thing we have to do here is to actually see what the props is. So here we simply say console.log props, and let's see what this gives us. And now in our expense list, we see that that prop is actually an object. You see, this is coming from expense list line 2, right? Expense list line 2. You see that that is actually an object. Let's open this. So it's an object containing our expenses, okay? So this is an object, and inside this object, we have our expenses, which is actually an array of these items, which is actually coming from the app component, okay? This particular array. I hope this is clear enough. Now you see that in this expense list, we now have access to that particular array. So we can now display that here in our expense list. Good. Now let's see how we can actually display that here. Let's clean this up. And now, since our expenses is actually an array, let's actually see how we can map over array in React. And to display this array, we are going to be displaying them as a list. So since we are going to display them as a list, we are going to be using the HTML list, okay? And here, let's use the unordered list. And inside this unordered list, we are going to have our list item. But first, let's give this a class name, and let's call this expense list. Okay, so in order to display this list, we don't want to start writing this list one after the other. What if we have 500 lists? Do we need to start writing all this? No, that is why we have to map over this. All we need here is a single list, okay? But in order to display everything, first, let's remove this and let's enter JavaScript mode, okay? So here we can now say props. Remember, that props gives us an object, and inside that object, we have expenses, right? So that will be prop.expenses, okay? These expenses. Then since these expenses is an array, we can use the map method, the array map method. And the array map method actually takes in a function, okay, a callback function. And in this callback function, we can pass each expense, okay? So we are going through all the expenses. For each expense, we want to do something, okay? So here, let's return a list item. We want to return a list item. So inside this list, let's add a div. First, let's have an h3. And inside this h3, we are going to pass our title. Okay, so in here, we simply say expense.title. Okay, expense.title, which is actually coming from this. Okay, so we have title, we have date, amount, and ID. Now, there is one thing about React. Whenever we are working with list in React, there is an important thing to put in mind. And that is the fact that whenever you are working with a list in React, whenever you map over a list in React, you need to pass an important prop. And this prop is what we call a key prop. This key prop will help React to keep track of any changes we make on this particular list. For instance, when you delete this particular item, or you update this particular item, React needs to actually keep track of which of these items in the array have you manipulated. Okay, with this key prop, React will be able to do that easily for us. And here we need to pass in a value that is unique, okay? A value that is different for each item in the array. So in this case, let's use the ID, because the ID is going to be unique. The title of our expense might not be unique because you can actually buy something twice, but the ID should be unique because most times this is actually coming from a database, and of course the ID from our database are always unique IDs. Okay, so here we pass this important prop. Let's actually give this list a class name, and let's just say expense item. Good. Now after this h3, let's simply add a paragraph. And for this paragraph, we want to add our amount. Okay, so here let's put a $sign. And after this $sign, we want to put our expense dot amount. Okay, but this amount might actually be a floating number. And we need to consider what user sees on our page. So we really want to manipulate our amount to look nice. So let's actually set a fixed decimal place. So here we simply use the JavaScript to fixed, which will actually return a string representing the number, but with a specified number of decimal places. Here we simply use 2 decimal places. Okay, good. And after this amount, let's now add our expense date. So here we simply say expense dot date. And finally, after this div, let's add a button. And for this button, we want this to be a delete button. So we can use an emoji here. Here you can search for waste. Okay, let's use this here. Okay, good. Now let's save this. And once we save this, there is actually a problem. Okay, nothing is shown on the page. And let's see what the problem is. Okay, we need to be happy with errors. Okay, so whenever you have errors, whenever you have issues, you don't have to be bothered. You just have to be happy about it. So the first thing you need to do is actually look at your console. When you go to your console, you will see this red line. Okay, you will see this here, and it's going to tell you exactly what is the cause of that error. So here we have uncaught type error. Okay, so this is a type error. Cannot read properties of undefined reading map. Let's see why. Because our expenses is actually an array. But let's see, oh, we missed the spelling. Okay, here look at what we have. This should be dot expenses. It must be exactly expenses, exactly what we have here. Okay, so if you go back here we have these expenses. Okay, so let's go back to this list and let's save this now. Let's refresh this page. Once you refresh that page, you have another error. Here we see that expense.amount.toFixed is not a function. And actually this is correct because this F here should actually be a capital letter. When you save that, we now have this. Good. We can clear this console now. Good. So we have our list and everything is working perfectly well. This here actually looks somehow ugly. Let's tie this a little bit before we proceed. Good. So let's grab the expense list dot expense list, okay, which is actually coming from here. Expense list. Let's remove these dots. So we set the list type to none. That removes the dots. Let's remove the padding. Let's remove also the margin. Okay, now let's tie each item. So if you go back to the expense list, here we have this expense item. Okay, so let's tie that. Dot expense item. Let's display flex. Let's justify content to space between. That should push this particular button here. Let's align items vertically to the center. Let's change the background. And for that, let's use ED F2 F7. Let's change the color. to 333. Let's set the padding to 10 pixels up and down, 15 pixels left and right. Let's add margin bottom. So for each of the list item, we want to add margin bottom of 12 pixels. And that gives this. Great. And let's add border radius of 8 pixels. And that is not bad. Okay. Let's quickly style the H3 inside our expense item. Let's set the margin to 0. And let's increase the font size. Let's use 18 pixels. Let's style the paragraph. Okay, the P dot expense item, the paragraph inside dot expense item. We want to set the margin to 4 pixels top, 0 left and right, 0 bottom. Okay, and let's change the color to 4A 5568. Let's type the delete button. Okay, let's set the border to none and let's save this file. This does not happen. Let's see .delete btn. Let's go to the expense list, and yeah, here we need to add a class name of delete btn, and let's save this. Okay, now we have this. Great. Let's go back to our CSS file. Here, let's simply set the cursor to pointer, and let's add some transition. Okay, so on transform, and let's use 0.3 seconds. Is now when we hover on this button, we want something to happen. So we need to use the over pseudo class. Okay, and now we use this transform. So transform, and let's simply scale 1.2. Great. Now we have this. Now let's also consider one more thing. What happens if there is no any list at all? So if there is no any list at all in our expense list, we want to show something. So let's clean up this file. Let's remove this console. And here we want to say that if props.expenses.length, so if the length of that array is equal to 0, so if the length of the array is equal to 0, that means we have an empty array, right? So in this case, we want to return a paragraph. And here we simply say no expenses yet. Okay, and let's save this. Let me close this side. So here we say if the props.expenses.length is equal to 0. So in that case, we don't want to see all this. We simply want to see this content here. Okay. Now let's go back to our app. And here in our app, let's actually remove all the items in this array. Okay, so let's remove this and save this file. Okay, now you can actually refresh this page, and here you see no expenses yet. Okay, so that works. Let's actually bring this back. Okay, and now we have these list items. Let's go back here on this expense list. There is one more thing I want to explain. Here we bring in these props, and remember when we checked the console, we saw that this props is actually an object containing our expenses. So we can simply destructure that object. Okay, we destructure that, and here we simply put expenses. That means here we no longer need props dots. Okay, so we can remove this, and we can directly use expenses.length, expenses.map, and these expenses must be the same name we used here. Here, if I change this to list, in my expense list, this here must be list. Okay, so let's change that back to expenses. Good. And let's go here and save this. So if you save this, you see that we still have the same thing. Great. Now we have built all our components. The next thing we want to do is to be able to add an expense. For instance, if I type an expense here and select my date, I want to be able to click on this add expense and see it on this page. Okay, so to do that, first, let's go back to the form itself. Okay, so inside this form, we will need to add states. Remember we said state is like the React memory, okay? So we need somehow, when we enter a title, enter the amount and submit this form, React needs to know about this, okay? So we are going to use a state here, and the state we put in a child component is called a local state, okay? So here, let's actually use a state for each of these fields we have here. And I am doing this so that we all understand the basics. Later, we see a better way of handling this. So for now, let's say const title, and here we simply say set title. And this is equal to use state. The initial value of this title should just be an empty string, okay? Next, let's add another state for the amount. So here we simply say amount and set amount. And this should be equal to use state. And here let's simply set the initial amount to 0, okay? Next, let's add the last one, which is going to be for the date. Date set date. I hope you see this naming right, okay? So here we simply say use state, and this is a string. This should be an empty string. Okay, so now we have 3 states, but for now, these states actually do nothing. So first, we need to bind each of these to this particular input field, okay? And in order to do that, we need to make each of these input field a controlled field, okay? A controlled field, okay? And to do that, the first thing we need to do is to pass value, and we're going to set the value of this input field to title. And let's save this. Now, let's change this to a state, okay? And let's save this. If you look at this now, you now see a state. So the value of this particular input field is now this state here, okay? So let's remove this, and let's also set the value here to amount, and value, this should be date. Now we are making use of the 3 states, and immediately you see this actually changed to 0 because the initial value here is 0. Good. The next thing we want to do is that whenever we enter any title here, we want to set that title to this particular title in the state. Currently, it is an empty string. So whichsoever text a user enter here, we want to set that to the value of this particular state, okay? And to do that, we need to use what we call events. Remember, in JavaScript, we have several types of events. For instance, if you visit youtube.com, okay, and let's say you click on this particular icon. If you click on this particular icon, it closes this sidebar here. So if you click on this, it closes that sidebar. This here is actually an event, okay? This is an event, and this is what we call a click event. When you click on this, we want something to happen, okay? But in our case here, this is actually another type of event. For instance, if you type a value here, we want something to happen. So in this case, when there is a change in this input field, we want something to happen. And because of that, we are going to use what we call an onChange event, okay? So here we simply say onChange. And here for now, I'm going to pass a callback function using arrow function. And this callback function is going to take in the event itself. So from this event, we can now access the value of this particular input field. So here we can now call, remember this is a function, right? Here we want to call the set title function. So we call the set title function, and we want to set the value, we want to set this title to the value of this input field. So we call the set title, and we pass E, which is this particular E, which represents event dot target, okay, dot value. And this is basically JavaScript. So what we did here is to actually set whatsoever the user enters on this input field, we set the value to this particular state here, okay? So let's see that in action. Here now, when we console.log, let's say title, let's go back here and let's open our console. Okay, and on our console, we see this error provided a value prop to a form field without an unchanged handler. Okay, and that is because of the other field we use this value and we've not added the unchanged. We are going to do that very soon. Okay, but now when you type anything here, okay, when you type anything here, we actually see it on the console, and this is coming from expense form line 8. So let's go back to our line 8, and on line 8 is actually where we are console.logging this particular title. So now this state is actually set to the value of this input field. Okay, so we do the same thing here on change. We use the callback function. Okay, we access the event and we set this to dot value. And we also do the same thing to this particular date field on change e. Okay, now we need to set date to e.target.value. Great. So now these states here are actually linked to our input field. The next thing we want to do now is whenever we enter all these details and we click on this add expense, remember this is a form, and as you see, whenever we click on this form, by default it will try to submit the form. Okay, because this button is inside the form element. By default, when you click on this button, it will try submitting the form. Okay, so when we submit this form, we want to access the values from these 3 fields. Okay, so on this particular form opening tag, we need to add another event. Okay, and this is the on submit. So on submit this form, we want something to happen. So let's simply add a particular function. Here we say undo submit. Okay, and you see here I am not calling the function, I am just referencing that function. React will call that function whenever we click on this submit, whenever we click on this submit button. Okay, so here let's actually add the function, because if you save this now we get an error because this function is not defined. So here we simply say undo submit, and this is a function, so function undo submit. Okay, now the error is gone. First, we want to stop this default behavior, the default behavior of refreshing this page each time we click on the submit. So here we need to bring in the events, and first we just say e.prevent event.prevent defaults. Okay, and when you save this now and click on this, you see, look at this icon, click on this. Okay, is no longer refreshing that page. Great. So the first thing we need to do is actually to make sure that a user enters valid information. So we will check if there is no title. For instance, if the user did not enter any title, or the user did not enter amount, or the user did not pick a date. So if there is no date, we actually don't want to do anything. So we simply return. Okay, good. Now, if the title is valid, amount is valid, and the date is valid, we want to see that here in this expense list. But the expense list is actually not living in this particular component. Remember, this is our expense form. We want to see whatsoever we enter here, we want to see it here. But the problem now is that these guys are not in the same place with this particular one. So we need to send all this information back to where this guy is living. And if we go back to our structure, app.js here, you see that the expense list is actually inside the app component. So we need to send back all this information to app.js, because inside the app.js, the expense list now have access to all our expenses. Okay, so now you see it's like the opposite. Before we used prop, Now we want to do child to parent communication. You see here that prop is simply parent to child communication, right? But now we want to pass information from a child component to a parent component. Okay, so first in this parent component, okay, this is the app component. Since our expenses lives in this app component, the first thing we want to do is to add a function that actually makes it possible to add an item to this particular expenses. Okay, so we want to add a function that we actually call this set expenses. So here, let's say function add expense, and this function will actually be expecting an expense. Okay, so for this particular function, okay, so the purpose of this function is to simply add an item to this particular array. Okay, and here we clearly see the structure of each item. So this function will be expecting an item of this particular form. Okay, so here we simply want to call this set expenses. So we call the set expenses. The set expenses can also take in a callback function. So it can also take in a callback function, and in this case we can simply use an arrow function. And this callback function can have access to the initial expenses, which is this array here. Can have access to the initial expenses. Here we can say previous expenses. Okay, so what do we want to do? Remember, we are not setting this to a new list. All we want to do is to simply add an item. Okay, so we need to know the previous expenses, and in here we just simply want to return an array. Okay, so in this particular array, first let's add an object, okay, which is going to host the new expenses. So we can destructure the expense, which is going to hold the new expense. So here we can destructure this expense, okay, comma, and we want to set the ID of this expense to date.now. Okay, because we said the ID should be unique, and here the ID is 1. Here we should actually change this to 2 and change this to 3. Otherwise we'll see a warning in our console. Okay, so now we have this, which represents the expense we want to add, and next we want to also add the previous expenses. So here we destructure the previous expenses. Okay, so we can now save this. Is to actually call this set expenses. So it calls this particular function. All it does is to first add the new item we created and also pass the remaining ones. Okay, so how will this work? This function is living in this app component, but we are adding this in this particular form component. So here in this form component, we will actually do something related to this. But now the child component will be the one sending information to the parent component. So here we can simply say on add expense to be equal to. So here we now actually reference this particular function. Here we say add expense. Okay, look, pay attention. We are not calling this function here. Okay, so we can simply copy this. Now let's go back here, and here we need to pass it just as we passed our prop. Okay, so we put this on add expense here. Okay, so inside this particular undo submit, when we submit this particular form, we now want to call this. Remember, this is a function, right? We want to call on add expense, and this function, let's go back to our app.js so you understand this. On add expense is actually set to this add expense. For this add expense here, we can't call it here. React will do that for us. But you need to pay attention to the fact that the add expense itself is expecting something, right? So here in the child component, for this on add expense, we now need to pass that particular item. So here, remember, it's an object, and the first one is the title. which represents this title. The next one is the amount. Okay, and for this amount, we want to set it to pass float of our amount. And finally, we want to send in the dates. Okay, so this is all we want to do. So we call this here and we pass all this information. Look at the relationship between what we did here and what we have here. Look at this. This guy is referencing this, and this expects this. So wherever we use this guy in the child component, we must pass the expense. Now let's save this and actually try to add this. Okay, let's refresh this, because that error is coming from the fact that here we add 111 before and we already changed that. So if you save this file, the error is actually gone. Now let's add something here. Let's just say, for now, let's say bread, and let's change this from 0 to 60. Let's select a date, maybe let's say 4th, and let's add expense. Now you see bread and everything works correctly. I hope you understand what we did here. But now we've added this bread and we still see this here. A user can actually enter this twice. So we need to improve the user experience, because truly, as a front-end developer, attention to details is also very important. So let's go back to our expense form. And once we send this information, the next thing we can do is actually to clear everything. We reset the state to the initial value. So we call the set title and we set this back to an empty string. We call the set amount and we set this back to 0. And we call the set date. We set this back to an empty string. So when we save this again, let's change this to, let's say, meet. And you try to save this. Once you save this, you see everything is cleared and we set everything to the initial state. Great. Great. Now that you are able to add an expense to the array of expenses, let's actually see a way of deleting a particular item from the list. So in order to delete an item from the list, we need to go to the expense list itself. So back to the expense list. Whenever we click on this button, we want to do something, okay? We want to delete a particular expense, right? So in order to do that, we can't actually delete any item from the expense list. Why? Because this array is not living inside this component. It's just like what we did now. Here, we want to add an item, but the expense form is not living inside the expense form. We need to communicate to the parents, okay? We need to tell the parent, hey parent, please add this item, okay? So the same thing we want to do here. Here we need to tell the parent, we need to go back to where this guy is coming from and tell that parent, hey, I want you to delete this item for me. So we will need to do something here. So in this case, we also use what we call events. And for this case, we are going to use the onClick event, because when we click on this particular icon, we want to delete that particular item. So onClick, remember we said we want to do just like what we did before. So here we can pass in another prop. And in this case, it's going to be on delete. Okay, so here now we can use arrow function, and with this arrow function we can now reference this on delete, and now we can pass the ID. So we want to pass expense.id. Now pay attention to what we are doing here. There is a difference between this and doing something like this. Okay, let me remove this, and here we now say on delete, and we are passing the ID expense.id. If you do this here, you are calling this function directly, and we don't actually want to call this directly, okay? So we have to do what we did before using an arrow function, okay? So here you see, using this arrow function, there is something different. Great. Now, this is all I need to do here. I just want to be able to know the ID of that specific expense. So now let's actually grab this on delete and let's go back to the parent component of this expense list. This is the parent component. And we just have to do just like what we did here. So here we simply pass on delete and we set this to undo delete. Okay, and there must be a space here. So here we are making reference to a particular function and we don't have the function yet. So we need to go back here after this add expenses. Let's say function undo delete. Okay, in this case, this undo delete actually needs to know the ID. And if you see what we did in this particular component for the on delete, we actually passed the ID, right? This is the expense.id. So let's go back here. So now in this undo delete, we have access to the ID. Okay, so here we can simply say ID. And what do we want to do? We simply want to delete an item from this array. And to do that, remember, this state is like the brain of React. So we need to tell, hey, React, I want to delete so item from this list. And for that, we need to call this set expenses. So we simply call the set expenses. Since we need to know the list of those expenses, we need to use a callback function here. And this callback, we take the previous expenses. We simply want to filter out any expense that has this particular ID. Okay, so here we need to return previous expenses dot filter. So we want to filter out any expense that has the ID of the one the user clicked. Okay, so here we have access to each of the expense, and now we simply want to return expense.id not equal to this ID that the user clicked. Okay, that is the expense with this particular ID. Now, if that works well, if you click on this, we actually delete the items. And now we can delete items from this particular array. So basically, we can now curate, we can read, and we can delete. Great. I want you to pause here, take your time, and go through what we've done. You don't have to cram anything. You just have to spend some time. Try to go through what we've done. Pause and rebuild this on your own. You will see how this sticks easily, and you'll be able to build any project of this form. So this here is the main goal of this particular project. And in the next one, we are going to add a button, another button here, that when you click on it, it's going to set the state here to whatsoever we have here, and we'll be able to update that particular expense. That is the goal for the next video. But for this video, I want to pause here and I need you to try this on your own. If you need access to the source code, please drop a comment in the comment section. And please, if you actually enjoyed this video, do not forget to like, join my channel by subscribing, hit the notification button to get more projects of this form, and one love. Bye.